In the winter of 1891, snow fell with a stubborn, unbroken silence over the cobblestone streets of McKeesport, a small industrial town in Pennsylvania whose air was always thick with the sour scent of damp coal and the metallic tang of cooling iron from the forges. Beneath that blanket of snow, beneath the soot-blackened facades and the shop windows fogged by the breath of passers-by, there lay a basement few dared to descend into, though officially no one was supposed to know it existed. It was a place that smelled of swollen, waterlogged wood, of rope gone soft with age, of something else. An indefinable perfume that recalled in equal parts human flesh and melted wax. And for years it remained invisible to most eyes. This story begins with a discovery, but to understand it one must first understand the silence that surrounded it for decades. The silence was not empty. It was thick, like a damp cloth pressed over the mouth, like a wall built from sidelong glances and rumors never spoken to completion. The old men, when they themselves had been boys, had seen a strange caravan arrive at the edge of the Monongahela River, a procession of wagons painted in colors that even then seemed faded, carrying a company of men and women who did not fit into the pattern of local life. Some had arms that bent in ways the eye could not quite reconcile. Others walked with uneven steps or remained swathed in heavy blankets even in the heat of July, their faces half hidden, their eyes searching the crowd as if for something lost or feared. For 2 weeks that summer, the strangers made camp just beyond the last row of brick houses, close enough for their music to drift across the riverbank, yet far enough that the townsfolk could pretend not to hear. At night, the sound of a calliope, thin and reedy, would rise above the insect hum and the slow current, a mournful wheeze of brass pipes breathing tunes that seemed too slow for dancing, too heavy for joy. The children were curious. The parents warned them to keep away. And still every morning, small footprints could be seen in the frost or the dust, leading toward the painted wagons, and sometimes not leading back. No one could say for certain when the first of them disappeared or if it was merely a trick of absence. A neighbor's boy visiting relatives, a girl sent away to work in the mills of Pittsburgh. But the memories of those years grew warped, like photographs left too close to the fire. People remembered glimpses, the shape of a tall man with a neck too long, standing by the water's edge, a woman whose face was perfectly symmetrical except for her eyes, which blinked at different intervals, the smell of singed hair that would drift through town on still mornings. These things were spoken of only in kitchens, in voices low enough that even the walls could not overhear. And then, as suddenly as they had arrived, the wagons were gone. The frost melted, the river swelled with spring rains, and life returned to its narrow routines. No one went to the meadow where they had camped. It was said the ground there stayed soft all year, that a horse's hoof would sink deeper than seemed natural. Those who ventured too close claimed to hear faint music, muffled as though played from under the earth. But by the time winter came, again, even those whispers faded, as if the land itself had drawn a curtain. It might have remained that way forever, an absence preserved by willful forgetting, had it not been for the repairs to the building on 5th Street. The building had been many things over the decades: a milliner's shop, a warehouse, a barber's parlor. By 1891, it was a shuttered curiosity, its windows boarded, its roof sagging. The owner had finally decided to sell, and so workmen were sent in to clear the debris and shore up the foundation. It was one of them, prying up a warped floorboard in the back room, who found the narrow set of steps leading down into the dark. The air that rose up was so cold it burned his throat. He later swore he could taste it for hours afterward. And there was, too, that smell, faint but unmistakable, that seemed to settle not in the nostrils, but somewhere deeper, as if the body itself recognized it before the mind could name it. The first man to descend those stairs carried only a hammer and the light of a single oil lamp. The flame wavered in the damp air, throwing nervous shadows that trembled along the rough stone walls. The steps were narrow, the wood swollen from years of hidden moisture, each creak deep and hollow, as though the sound traveled much farther than the space beneath could account for. The others stayed above, leaning in to hear. None of them would later agree on how long he was gone. Some swore it was only a few minutes, others insisted it was closer to an hour. When he returned, his face was the pale of candle fat, and his lips pressed into a line so tight they almost vanished. He said nothing at first, only gestured for the foreman to follow him down. The foreman, a man named Elijah Rathburn, who had worked in the mills for 20 years and had seen his share of crushed hands and burned skin, was not easily rattled. Yet those who watched him vanish into the dark swore that when he emerged, the lamplight shook in his grasp, and his gaze refused to meet theirs. They spoke quietly, just the two of them, though the others caught fragments. Something about chairs, about the way they were arranged, about the ropes. One of the workmen laughed nervously and asked if they had found a distillery, but neither answered. Instead, they called for boards to be nailed over the opening and for the rest of the men to take an early lunch. It was 2 days before word reached the town's constable, a man named Thadwick Howe, whose uniform was so worn the brass buttons had lost their shine. Howe was not inclined toward superstition. His father had been a surveyor and had taught him that every piece of land had a history written in its soil if one had the patience to read it. But even he hesitated when he stepped into that shuttered building and saw the black square in the floor where the boards had been pried up again. The air in the basement was colder than the streets above, though there was no draft. The smell was stronger now, sharper, carrying with it a sweetness that sickened. The beam of Howe's lantern slid over the stone walls and settled on the far end of the room, where the shadows seemed denser. There, in the wavering light, sat 17 wooden chairs, each with a figure bound to it. They were not skeletons, though the skin clung tight to the bones. They were not fresh dead either. Their faces had collapsed into hollows, lips drawn back from teeth in a perpetual grimace. The ropes that held them were the same kind used for stage rigging. Thick, coarse, the fibers stiff with age. Each figure wore a costume, sequined jackets dulled with dust, faded silks, stiffened lace collars. The colors, muted by time, still, hinted at their former brightness, crimson, gold, sapphire, but all had been drained to the same ashen hue under the damp air. Their eyes, in those that still had them, were open. Howe did not count them at first. It was only later, when he turned to leave, and the flame of his lantern caught the curve of a pale hand, that he realized the chairs formed a half circle, 17 in all, facing a low platform built from mismatched boards. Upon the platform stood a single music stand, empty except for a sheet of paper that had melted into pulp from years of moisture. Beside it, the rusted husk of a calliope pipe lay on its side, the brass eaten through. The basement floor was earthen, and here and there the dirt was mounded, as though something beneath had swelled and pressed upward. Howe would later insist. He could hear a faint strain of music when he stood on those rises, though the others who entered claimed to hear nothing. What they all agreed on, however, was that the air grew heavier the longer one stayed. Not colder, but as though some weight pressed down on the lungs, making each breath feel borrowed. The constable ordered the bodies left as they were until the coroner could be brought from Pittsburgh. He had to walk alone to the telegraph office. The workmen refused to accompany him, claiming their tools had been left behind, but making no move to retrieve them. By the time the coroner arrived 2 days later, the snow had deepened, and the basement's narrow steps were slick with ice. The coroner took one look at the bound figures, muttered something in German, and refused to touch them until daylight. That night, the watchman posted outside swore that, between the hours of midnight. And 2, he heard chairs scraping against the floorboards below. He did not investigate. The coroner, Dr. Matthias Ruprecht, arrived with the kind of caution one reserves for a place already steeped in whispers. He was a tall, stooped man whose spectacles were always fogged by his own breath and whose manner suggested he had seen too much of death to be sentimental about it. Yet even he paused at the threshold of that basement, peering into the lamplight as though uncertain whether to cross. When he did descend, he moved slowly, almost reverently, his boots sinking slightly into the earthen floor. The examination began at dawn, with the windows above unshuttered so that a sliver of pale light might reach the steps. Ruprecht worked, in silence, bending over each figure in turn, his gloved hands tracing the cords, the seams of the costumes, the angles of each rigid limb. He found no signs of struggle. The ropes had been knotted deliberately, expertly, and in some cases the bindings had been reinforced with wire thin enough to cut into the skin. One by one, he noted the peculiarities of their forms. A man whose spine curved so severely his head tilted backward like a hinged lid. A woman of slight build whose hands were large and delicate as those of a pianist, the fingers bound tightly to the armrests. A boy whose legs ended abruptly above the knees, his wooden prosthetics still strapped to his thighs beneath the costume's silk. From the state of the remains, Ruprecht estimated they had been dead for over 20 years. The preservation was irregular. In some, the skin was parchment dry. In others, damp patches clung where the air could not circulate. No rodents had disturbed them, no insects nested in the hollowed cheeks. The coroner could not explain this, though he muttered more than once that the basement's air was wrong. He declined to elaborate when pressed. By mid-afternoon, Howe and Ruprecht agreed to remove the bodies for further study, but the attempt was met with a resistance neither could account for. The ropes, though brittle in appearance, would not yield to the knife without great force. In some places, the fibers seemed to fuse with the costumes, as if stitched into the very fabric. When the first figure was finally freed, the chair beneath it collapsed, revealing deep grooves worn into the wooden seat, grooves that matched with unsettling precision the outline of the figure's bound wrists. It was then that the first rumors began to take shape, though they did not emerge from the workmen or the constable's reports. They came from the oldest residents of McKeesport, who remembered the summer of the caravan. In 1869, a traveling exhibition calling itself Barnabas Klein's Peerless Pageant of Peculiarities had arrived from the south, making its way along the river towns. It was said to be a show unlike any other, a gathering of human curiosities, performers whose very bodies were the spectacle. In those days, such exhibitions were not uncommon, but Klein's pageant carried with it an air of something heavier, a dignity, some claimed, or a kind of solemnity that kept laughter from rising as easily as it did in other tents. Barnabas Klein himself was remembered as a tall, gaunt man who never removed his gloves and who spoke in a voice so low that listeners often leaned forward to hear, only to feel a chill when his eyes fixed on theirs. His performers were said to be loyal to him beyond reason, rarely straying from the caravan, never speaking to outsiders unless he was present. The show traveled with its own cook, its own seamstress, even its own chaplain, an elderly man who preached sermons no townsfolk were invited to hear. During their stay in McKeesport, the pageant had set up in a meadow by the river, charging a nickel for entry. Inside the great tent, the air was heavy with the scent of oil lamps and perfumed smoke. Witnesses recalled seeing acts both beautiful and unsettling, a contortionist whose body bent like rope in the hands of an unseen knot-maker, a woman whose hair reached the floor and swayed as though moved by an invisible current, a man whose skin was painted in patterns of gold and black that shimmered when he moved, though no one could say whether it was paint or something deeper. But after the second week, the music changed. The calliope no longer played its lively marches. instead producing slow, dragging melodies that seemed to sag under their own weight. The performers began appearing in the town less often, and when they did, their faces were blank, their eyes rimmed in red as though from lack of sleep. And then, without notice, the caravan vanished before dawn one morning. The meadow stood, empty but for deep wheel ruts in the soil and patches of earth that seemed freshly turned. No one connected that departure to any disappearance at the time. No one wanted to. Yet now, 22 years later, the 17 figures in the basement bore an undeniable resemblance to those who had performed that summer. Ruprecht wrote in his ledger that evening that he believed the bodies had been placed there deliberately, perhaps as part of some ritualized preservation. He did not speculate on motive, but he recorded one final curious detail. In the pocket of the smallest figure's jacket, he found a ticket stub, faded, water-stained, but still legible enough to read the printed words, "Admit one. Barnabas." Klein's peerless pageant of peculiarities. The discovery of the ticket stub altered the nature of the case in subtle but irreversible ways. Until then, the bodies in the basement might have been explained as the remains of some private tragedy, a family bound together by desperation or madness. But the stub drew a line, however faint, back to the summer of 1869 and to a company of strangers who had passed through, leaving behind little more than a ripple in the memory of the town. That ripple now spread, widening into a circle that touched the lives of those who had tried so hard to forget. Constable Howe began visiting the oldest residents, moving from one narrow, draft-heavy parlor to the next, coaxing recollections from mouths that trembled with age and reluctance. Some claimed not to remember, others remembered too much, speaking in fragments, their eyes unfocused as if recalling something glimpsed through smoke. A few gave accounts so similar in detail that it became difficult to dismiss them as invention. They spoke of the pageant's final performances, how the Calliope's music slowed, how the performers' smiles faltered, how Barnabas Klein himself seemed to grow more gaunt, his gloved hands shaking as he adjusted the ropes and pulleys that lifted the tent each evening. One woman, Mrs. Van Gilder, swore she had seen Klein walking alone by the river at night, speaking to someone she could not see. She had thought at first he was praying, but as she drew closer, she realized his lips moved too quickly, as though he were reciting something memorized, his voice clipped and rhythmic. She turned back before he noticed her, but she claimed the water near where he stood was strangely still, despite the current. Others spoke of the performers wandering into town in pairs, sometimes in the middle of the night, their costumes half-fastened, their feet bare and bleeding. When approached, they would not answer, only turn their faces away and continue walking. By the last 3 nights, not a single lamp was lit in the meadow after dark, and the tent flaps remained closed even during the day. And then there was the matter of the chaplain. His name, according to those who could remember it, was Reverend Elias Ward. He had been an imposing figure, tall but hunched, with a long coat that brushed the ground and a white scarf wound twice about his neck regardless of the heat. No one in McKeesport had heard him preach, but the performers treated him with an almost fearful respect, stepping aside when he passed, bowing their heads. On the final evening before the caravan's disappearance, several townsfolk swore they saw him standing in the field alone, facing the tent with his arms raised as though in benediction. A faint sound, like the murmur of many voices in unison, seemed to come from within the tent, though no light escaped its seams. The next morning, the meadow was empty. Howe traced the caravan's supposed route southward along the Monongahela, but records were sparse. A ledger from a riverfront inn in Brownsville bore the inked scrawl, Klein, 17 rooms, dated 3 days after their departure. But no one in Brownsville remembered their stay, and by the time Howe reached the next town, the trail had gone, cold entirely. Meanwhile, Ruprecht's examination continued. He had transported 3 of the bodies to his small mortuary, intending to study them in detail. Yet within days, he began to suffer from splitting headaches and oppressive pressure behind his eyes that worsened in the presence of the corpses. The headaches were accompanied by faint music, a wheezing, metallic strain that seemed to grow louder when he bent close to the remains. At first, he assumed it was a symptom of his condition, until his assistant, a young apprentice named Alan, reported hearing it as well. On the 4th night after their arrival, Alan fled the mortuary entirely. He claimed the music had followed him home, faint at first, but growing until it filled his small attic room. It was not the tune itself that drove him out, he said, but the sense that it was meant to accompany something. A spectacle, perhaps, that required an audience. By the time Howe returned to McKeesport, Ruprecht had sealed the 3 bodies in the coldest room of his mortuary and refused to enter without another person present. He told the constable, in a low voice, that he believed the pageant had ended in that basement by design, that the arrangement of the chairs, the costumes, the bindings, all suggested a performance brought to its final act, frozen in place for an audience that had never arrived. And when Howe asked him why he thought the audience never came, Ruprecht's hands trembled as he set down his pen. "They did," he said. "You and I are sitting in it now. The Reverend Elias Ward proved more difficult to trace than Barnabas Klein." In the weeks following the discovery, Howe wrote to churches across Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia, seeking any record of his ordination. Most returned polite rejections. A few returned more troubling replies, noting that a man matching his description had been expelled from their congregations decades earlier for doctrinal irregularities. One letter from a small parish in Wheeling went further, stating that Ward had once served as a traveling preacher along the river towns, offering sermons not from the Bible, but from a battered leather volume whose cover bore no title. The parishioner who wrote the letter claimed the book's pages were covered in symbols rather than words, and that Ward often spoke to the congregation in a language none of them understood. Howe did not share these letters with the townsfolk. He suspected the truth, if spoken aloud, would only entangle the investigation in rumor and hysteria. Yet privately, he began to suspect that Ward's presence in the caravan was more than spiritual. In the cold, cramped office above the constable's quarters, Howe pored over the coroner's notes by lamplight. Each of the 17 bound performers had been placed in such a way that their eyes, if open, were fixed on the music stand upon the low platform. In the corner of the basement, half buried under a spill of dirt, they had found a second stand, this one empty, its wood scorched along the edges. Between them, the earth bore faint impressions, not footprints, but circular depressions, as if something heavy had been set there for a long time. The most disturbing find, however, came when they pried loose a panel in the stone wall behind the platform. Inside, in the narrow cavity, lay an assortment of objects. A child's porcelain mask with its paint nearly flaked away, a length of red ribbon stiffened with some unidentifiable residue, and a stack of folded papers that disintegrated at the touch. One sheet survived long enough to reveal a sketch, a rough charcoal drawing of the 17 performers in their chairs, each rendered in surprising detail. Above them, drawn larger than any human figure, was the outline of a shape Howe could not name. Not quite an instrument, not quite a man, its form bending in upon itself like a knot. When the constable showed the sketch to Ruprecht, the coroner grew pale and insisted it be burned. He offered no explanation, only muttering that such likenesses hold too much. Meanwhile, the whispers in town thickened. Mrs. Van Gilder's account of seeing Klein at the river spread, and others added their own embellishments, that the still water had reflected no moonlight, that the ripples had moved against the current, that Ward had been seen standing on the opposite bank with his scarf hanging loose around his neck. By the end of the month, it was common talk that the basement had been a stage, and that whatever performance had taken place there had been meant not for the living, but for something else entirely. Alan, the coroner's apprentice, left McKeesport altogether. Before he went, he stopped Howe in the street and pressed something into his hand, a small scrap of paper on which he had scrawled the notes to a short melody. "It's the tune," Alan said, his eyes red-rimmed. "If you hear it, you'll know. And if you hear it twice, don't stay in the same room." Without waiting for a reply, he walked on toward the train station and did not look back. 2 nights later, Howe woke in his narrow bed to the sound of faint music drifting through his window. The notes were halting, uncertain, as though played by an unpracticed hand on an unseen instrument. He rose, lit a lamp, and looked out into the snow-quiet street. No one was there. Yet the melody persisted, growing clearer until he could match it to the scrawl Alan had given him. It ended abruptly, like a sentence left unfinished. The silence that followed was heavier than the sound had been, and it carried with it the same feeling he had known in the basement, the sense that someone, somewhere, was watching not him, but the space he occupied, as though waiting for it to be filled. The following morning, Howe found boot prints in the snow outside his window. They led halfway down the street before vanishing entirely, as though the walker had stepped into the air. The name Barnabas Klein, unlike Reverend Ward's, appeared sporadically in the ledgers and broadsheets of river towns from Pittsburgh to Louisville. Most were simple notices, advertisements for the peerless pageant of peculiarities, praising its artistry and variety, but a few were stranger. In a Cincinnati paper from the summer of 1870, a short item reported that B. Klein, impresario of the notable traveling exhibition, was questioned by local constables in connection with the unexplained disappearance of a farm boy from Boone County. No charges were filed. The pageant performed for 2 more nights before leaving without farewell. Howe read each clipping in silence, his fingers smudged with old ink. In every account, Klein was described the same way: tall, gloved, his attire immaculate despite the hardships of travel. Witnesses disagreed on his age, some placing him in his 40s, others insisting he could not be younger than 60. None could agree on the color of his eyes. The trail curved in unexpected directions. In Marietta, Ohio, a faded playbill bore the familiar stylized lettering of the pageant, but listed only 16 acts. One was missing. A name struck through in heavy ink. The bill was dated just a week after the caravan had left McKeesport in 1869. When Howe asked the elderly archivist about the omission, the man hesitated, then said he believed the missing name was Isolde, a singer whose voice was as sweet as glass breaking. She had performed only once in Marietta and then vanished from the lineup without explanation. That night, back in McKeesport, Howe laid out the details in sequence. 17 bound bodies in the basement, 17 rooms booked in Brownsville, but only 16 acts in Marietta. If Isolde was absent there, had she died? Or had she gone elsewhere? The thought gnawed at him. A break came unexpectedly. A letter arrived from a sheriff in Wheeling who had heard of Howe's investigation. In the winter of 1871, he wrote, "A woman calling herself Belle Corvin had been found wandering the outskirts of town. She was barefoot, dressed in what looked like the remnants of a stage costume, her hair matted with frost. She spoke little, but when pressed for her name, she whispered, 'Isolde,' before lapsing into silence. She stayed in the local infirmary for nearly 3 months, during which she refused to enter any room where music was playing. One night she left without taking her belongings. She was last seen walking south along the river. Howe could not let the matter rest. He asked the sheriff for any personal effects the woman had left behind. Weeks later, a parcel arrived containing only a small silk pouch. Inside was a fragment of paper, brittle with age, on which had been drawn the lower half of a face, a woman's. with full lips slightly parted as if mid-song. The upper half of the head was missing, as though the artist had stopped suddenly or the rest had been deliberately cut away. When Howe showed the fragment to Ruprecht, the coroner's reaction was immediate. He turned the paper over, refusing to look at the image, and said only, "That mouth could open wider than it should." The comment unsettled Howe more than he cared to admit. In the days that followed, he began to notice small changes in his surroundings. A faint scent of lamp oil lingering in rooms where no lamp had burned, a sensation of the floorboards subtly vibrating underfoot, as if some distant machinery were at work. Twice, while reviewing his notes late at night, he heard the creak of a chair shifting its weight in the empty room behind him. Each time he turned, the room was still, save for the faint echo of something unsaid. One evening, unable to sleep, Howe walked to the boarded building on 5th Street. The snow had crusted over the roof, and icicles hung like teeth from the eaves. He stood outside for a long time, listening. Beneath the muffled stillness of winter, he thought he could hear it. Not music this time, but the faint, rhythmic intake of breath, as though the building itself were holding something in. When he left, he did not notice the boot prints in, the snow following his own until they stopped abruptly at the edge of the lamplight. The snow was still deep along 5th Street when Howe ordered the boards removed from the trapdoor. He gave no official reason, telling the laborers only that the coroner required a final survey before the basement could be sealed permanently. None of the men who had been present at the first discovery returned for the task. Those who came in their place worked quickly, their eyes darting toward the dark opening as though it might swell and consume the room around it. Howe descended alone. The lamplight pooled at his feet, barely pushing back the darkness. The chairs were as they had been, 17 in their half-circle, the costumes dulled by dust, the bound figures slumped in attitudes too uniform to be natural. But something had changed. The mounded patches of earth were larger now, more pronounced, as though whatever had swelled beneath had pressed harder against the surface. He paced slowly between the chairs, taking note of details he had missed before. A faint ring of lighter dirt surrounded each chair's legs, suggesting they had once stood elsewhere and been moved here. On the rear wall, half hidden by shadow, his lamp revealed a faint chalk mark, a series of concentric circles crossed by diagonal lines. It was no decorative flourish. The lines were too sharp, too deliberate, the outermost circle smudged by a hand that had brushed it recently. In the far corner, near the low platform, the earth had shifted. Howe knelt and dug at the loose soil with his gloved hands until he struck wood, a small crate, its lid nailed down. When he pried it open, the smell that escaped was so thick and cloying it seemed to coat the inside of his mouth. Inside, wrapped in yellowed cloth, were several items. A metal mouthpiece from a wind instrument, its surface tarnished to black, a length of braided hair bound at one end with copper wire, and a program printed in faded ink, its heading reading, "Klein's Peerless Pageant, 1847 season." Howe's pulse quickened. The pageant had been performing decades before the McKeesport summer, long enough to suggest that what had happened in that basement was part of a pattern, repeated across time and place. He took the program to Ruprecht, who turned its brittle pages with care. The acts listed bore a disturbing resemblance to the bound figures below. A man whose body could fold in half, a woman with hair to her ankles, a boy without legs. And yet the names differed, as if the roles had been inherited, passed from one performer to another over the years. "That's not how these shows work," Ruprecht murmured. "Performers come and go, they age, they leave. But these, they repeat." The coroner then pointed to the final line at the bottom of the program, printed in smaller type than the rest. "Finale, the benediction of breath." No description followed. That night. Howe sat at his desk, the program laid out before him, and traced each name with his finger. He tried to imagine the 1847 performance, the stage, the chairs, the music. And in his mind, he began to hear it. Not the halting tune Alan had given him, but a deeper, fuller melody, heavy with brass and breath, winding slowly upward until it broke into a silence so absolute it seemed to swallow the air itself. In that imagined silence, he saw the audience, not the townsfolk, but something else entirely, sitting unseen in the darkness beyond the footlights. A knock at the door startled him. It was past midnight. When he opened it, no one stood there. Only a folded scrap of paper lay on the step, weighted by a small brass button. Inside, written in a hand he did not know, were 3 words. It begins again. Hal could not sleep. The note lay on his desk beside the brass button, its smooth surface warm from his handling. At dawn, he took the program and the button to the Municipal Archives, a squat brick building whose air was as dry as the paper it guarded. The clerk, a man with rheumy eyes and a habit of speaking only in whispers, guided him to a series of bound ledgers and broadsheets from the mid-19th century. It took hours before the trail emerged, but once it did, it was unmistakable. Klein's peerless pageant had traveled from Rivertown to Rivertown, Wheeling, Marietta, Portsmouth, each time arriving in the spring, performing through summer and vanishing before the first frost. In nearly every case, the season ended with a brief notice buried among advertisements. Local youth missing, mysterious illness claims 6, troop departs suddenly after incident. In 1853 in Louisville, the notice was longer. A warehouse fire, 17 casualties, all listed as non-residents of the county. No burial records, no next of kin. Only a line at the end stating that the property had been cleared and sold within the month. Howe sketched a map of their movements, drawing red lines along the Ohio River, down into Kentucky, up toward Pittsburgh. The pattern formed a slow, deliberate curve, looping back on itself every 20 years. If the cycle held, 1891 was not an end, but the midpoint of another loop. He spent the afternoon examining playbills, photographs, and handbills. In image after image, the performers stood in stiff, formal poses, the painted backdrops behind them curling at the edges. In the center of each group stood a man Howe could not name. Tall, thin, clean-shaven, with a dark coat buttoned high at the neck. His expression was never quite the same, yet his posture, the tilt of his head, the way his gloved hand rested on a cane, were identical across decades. The photographs from 1847 and 1873 could have been taken on the same day. By evening, Howe's eyes ached from the close work, but one last fragment caught his attention. A letter preserved in the effects of a deceased archivist, written in 1865, from a sheriff in Gallipolis, Ohio to his counterpart in Wheeling. The ink had faded to brown, but the words were still legible. Do not allow the company calling itself Klein's Peerless Pageant to winter within your jurisdiction. Their presence is a burden beyond what your people can bear. When the last notes of their benediction are sounded, you will find they have left you something you cannot name, and taken from you something you will never retrieve. That night, as the wind rattled the windows of his boarding house, Howe tried to imagine what the sheriff had meant. Left something, taken something. What could weigh so heavily, yet leave no physical trace? His thoughts turned to the 17 chairs in the basement, the way their occupants had seemed both present and absent, as though their essence had been displaced into some unseen ledger. Sleep came at last, and with it a dream of an empty theater. The air was thick with the smell of old cloth and oil lamps. Somewhere in the dark, a reed instrument began to play a slow, looping melody, each phrase circling back on itself like the lines he had drawn on his map. From the stage, the tall man in the dark coat turned his head, and though his face was not familiar, Howe felt certain it had been looking at him for far longer than he had been alive. When he awoke, the brass button was no longer on his desk. The search for witnesses began in the most obvious places: the census rolls, the obituaries, the city directories of towns where the peerless pageant had passed. Most who might have remembered the company were long dead, and those who remained were either too young at the time or had left the region entirely. Howe's inquiries were met with polite evasion, clipped denials, and in one case a door closed without a word. At last, in a back corner of the McKeesport Public Library, an elderly woman named Mrs. Petrow, who sorted donated books for resale, mentioned a man living upriver in Glassport. He had been a boy in 1853 when the pageant wintered there. His name was Wetherill. "He's near 90, she said, eyes narrowing, "and not inclined to visitors, but he still walks the river path in the mornings." 2 days later, Howe found him there, a narrow, stooped figure in a long wool coat, leaning on a cane with a carved ivory handle. The air smelled of wet stone and leaf mold. The river's surface was the dull green of old glass. Howe introduced himself, spoke of his research, mentioned the name Klein's Peerless Pageant. The old man's stride did not falter, but his eyes shifted, and for a moment the muscles along his jaw tightened. He did not answer at once, and Howe filled the silence with a careful description of the program and the brass button. Finally, Wetherill stopped and turned, his gaze meeting Howe's with a weight that felt almost physical. His voice, when it came, was dry and deliberate. "You have seen something," he said. "It is already in you. Asking about it will only make it more so." Howe began to press him. What had happened in Glassport? What had been taken? But the old man raised a one-gloved hand. "Do you hear them?" he asked. Howe listened. There was only the wind, the distant clink of a barge chain. "It is not now," Wetherill said, "but when it comes, you will know it by the way the air changes, as if a room you are in has become smaller, though nothing has moved." They stood there for a moment, the river flowing past in slow, cold swells. Then Wetherill resumed walking, cane tapping the wet stones. "Leave it alone," he called over his shoulder. "You can record the facts, but the benediction is not for writing. It is for keeping inside until it hollows you out." That night, in his room, Howe wrote down every word the old man had said. As he did, a faint scent rose in the air, not from any candle or lamp, but something older: beeswax, dust, and a trace of perfume that seemed to vanish whenever he tried to name it. He opened the window to the winter wind, yet the scent remained, clinging to the paper. When he placed the notebook in his drawer, he felt the faintest shift beneath the floorboards, as if someone had stepped lightly just outside the range of his sight. 3 weeks passed before the invitation arrived, though it did not come in the form of a letter. Howe found it instead on the blotter of his desk one morning, a folded sheet of thick cream-colored paper, faintly yellowed without a seal or postmark. Inside, in a small and precise hand, were 7 words: "If you would see, come tonight." Beneath them, an address in McKeesport's old mill district, a part of the city long since abandoned by commerce, where warehouses stood like blind giants along the tracks. Howe had no recollection of leaving his study unlocked, yet the paper lay as though it had been placed there moments before. He dressed warmly and carried no more than his notebook and a pencil, telling no one where he was going. The night air was brittle with frost, the lamps casting halos in the fog rising from the river. The address led him to a narrow, 3-story brick building with a single iron door, unmarked but for a small brass slot at eye level. He knocked. After a moment, the slot slid open, and a pair of dark eyes studied him. The door swung back soundlessly, revealing a tall man in a black coat, his face pale and composed. "You will not write here," the man said, and took Howe's pencil, placing it in his own pocket. The interior smelled of coal soot and cold metal, but beneath that lingered something more delicate, an odor that recalled the scent in Howe's room after speaking with Wetherill, beeswax, faintly floral, edged with the dryness of old paper. The man led him up a flight of iron stairs, each step flexing under their weight. They stopped before a door of paneled oak with a chain lock and 3 separate brass bolts. The man produced a key ring so old the iron was worn thin in places. When the door opened, Howe saw a room lit only by a single oil lamp on a desk at the far wall. The space was small, the air close and dry, as if sealed for many years. Glass-fronted cabinets lined the walls, their shelves crowded with objects whose purpose was not immediately clear. A half-mask of white leather, the jaw section removed, a set of tiny silver bells tarnished black, a child's shoe with no sole, lengths of colored ribbon, each folded precisely and secured with a pin. At the center of the room stood a tall wooden chest with its lid propped open. Inside lay a stack of programs, their paper browned and brittle, each bearing the words, "Klein's Peerless Pageant," in fading gilt. Howe reached for one, but the man's hand intercepted his. "Only the left-hand column," he said. "The right was never meant for the audience." Howe looked closer. In the pale light, the right column of each page bore a different list, written not in print, but in an angular, cramped script, each entry beginning with a date and ending with a single name. The dates did not correspond to performances. They were irregular, months, sometimes years apart. The names were unremarkable, save that every 5th or 6th bore the note retained. "How many?" Howe began, but the man shook his head. "Numbers matter less than order," he said. "And once you understand the order, you will no longer need to ask." The lamp flickered as if from a draft, though the room had no open window. From somewhere in the cabinets came the faintest sound, the brush of fabric against wood, so slight Howe might have imagined it. The man in the black coat closed the chest and replaced the bolts on the door as if sealing away a volatile substance. Without speaking, he motioned for Howe to follow him down another narrow corridor, this one descending by degrees into cooler, damper air. The stone walls were rough here, beaded with moisture, and the dim light from the man's lantern made the shadows appear to breathe. They stopped before a second door, this one of heavy pine bound with iron straps. On it was painted a crude number, 17, in a style too plain to be theatrical. The man set down the lantern, slid free the locking bar, and pulled the door open. What lay beyond was not the stage or storage room Howe half expected, but a corridor lined on both sides by narrow wooden partitions, each with a small square cut into the upper half. Through those squares, in the dull glow of the lantern, faces looked out. Not mannequins, not portraits, faces. The skin had the waxen pallor of the long dead, yet the eyes were glassy, faintly moist, reflecting the flame in small, shifting points. The mouths were closed, their lips dry but intact. Each figure was bound upright, their heads supported by thin wooden braces. Their clothing was unfamiliar to Howe, garments of strange cut, foreign cloth, outdated by decades, 17 in all. Each partition bore a brass plaque engraved with a name and a year. Some years were distant, 1864, 1878, while others fell shockingly close, 1889, 1890. A few names matched the lists in the chest upstairs, marked retained. Howe felt the damp in the air settle into his bones. But the man in the coat moved forward without hesitation, stopping before the third figure on the left. It was a woman, her face narrow and delicate, her hair pinned in a style that might once have been elegant. Beneath her name and date was a smaller plaque that read simply, Leipzig. Howe began, but the man cut him off quietly. "Not how," he said. "When? They are kept as they were, at the moment they left the stage. No decay, no change. Retained." The figures were too perfect to be the result of embalming alone. The skin was taut, not shrunken, the eyes wet and bright, as if their owners might stir at any moment. As the lantern's light moved, Howe thought he saw the faintest flutter in the throat of the sixth figure. A man with one arm bound tight across his chest, his knuckles white beneath the skin. The sound that reached him then was almost inaudible, like the damp rustle of cloth. The man in the coat placed a hand on Howe's shoulder. "We do not speak of this," he said, his voice low but firm. "To speak too often is to invite the wrong kind of attention. And attention is what they cannot bear." Howe tore his gaze from the rows of faces, but the sensation of being watched clung to him as the door closed. In the darkness behind it, the soft sound continued, steady, patient, as though the performance were merely paused, awaiting its next cue. The next morning, the rain had returned, sluicing down the town's narrow streets in thin, steady streams. Howe sat at a small desk in the upstairs room he'd been given, a ledger from the locked chest open before him. The handwriting inside was precise but old-fashioned, the ink browned with time. Each page was a roster, divided by year, each name accompanied by a single word: released, dismissed, retained. The retained names now held a weight they had not the day before. Beside them were faint notations in another hand, coordinates, foreign cities, obscure references like Rothschild House or the Pines. Some bore dates of disappearance, others only a dash, as though their final fate had never been marked. He turned to the year 1887 and found it blank. No names, no marks. The same was true for 1883, 1871, 1869. It was as if the troupe had simply ceased to exist in those years, only to reappear with new entries the following season. Yet the ages and descriptions of the retained suggested something stranger. Some had joined only to vanish within weeks. Others had performed for years before their final entry. The sound of boots on the hallway floor drew his attention. The man, in the black coat, entered without knocking, closing the door softly behind him. He carried a folded sheet of newsprint, yellowed and brittle. Without a word, he placed it on the desk. It was an article dated October 3, 1878, from a Philadelphia paper, reporting the disappearance of Miss Elise Harrow, 22, last seen leaving the stage of the Lyric Hall during a traveling performance. The engraving beside the text showed the same delicate face Howe had seen in the partition marked Leipzig. "They have been collected for longer than you imagine," the man said. "Some never belonged to us. They were taken mid-performance, mid-life, drawn into the fold without consent. That is why certain years are empty. The gathering was elsewhere." Howe read the article twice, the fine hairs on his arms rising despite the warmth of the room. "Why retain them?" he asked finally. The man only shook his head. "Because there is no audience once they are gone from the stage. They must be preserved for an audience that has yet to arrive. You will come to understand." The words lodged in Howe's mind like grit in a wound. He thought again of the brass plaques, the eyes that reflected the lantern light. The man spoke as if the performances were not entertainment, but a form of binding, a keeping. Somewhere between the moment the curtain fell and the next night's show, a decision was made, and the chosen never left. Later, unable to sleep, Howe stood at the narrow window of his room, watching the lamplight flicker on the wet street below. In the reflection on the glass, faint and far behind him, he thought he saw the outline of a narrow face, its eyes bright and unblinking. When he turned, the room was empty. Yet the smell of damp wood and faintly sweet rot clung to the air as if a door had only just closed. Howe rose before dawn, the air inside the room so cold that his breath lingered pale in the dim light. He dressed quickly, keeping his boots in hand to muffle his movements, and stepped out into the stairwell. Below, the innkeeper snored in his chair beside the banked embers of the hearth. Outside, the streets lay empty, but for the sound of the river shifting under a crust of ice, carrying bits of thawing wood and the smell of distant smoke. At the courthouse, he requested access to the town's civic registers, births, marriages, deaths, citing his work as a historical chronicler. The clerk, a weary woman in her 60s, produced heavy ledgers bound in leather and smelling of dust and ink. He began with the name from the Leipzig partition, Elise Harrow, expecting to find at least a birth record, but the columns yielded nothing. Not in this township nor in the county at large. He broadened the search, taking the list of retained names he had copied in secret from the ledger. Out of 24, only 3 appeared in any official record, and each entry ended abruptly. A marriage license issued but no record of the union, a notice of residence but no date of departure, a medical report signed but not followed by a death certificate. It was as if these people had been pulled from the fabric of the town before the threads could tighten around them. When Howe asked to see theater registries and itinerant performance licenses, the clerk hesitated. "Some of those went missing years ago," she said, eyes fixed on the page in front of her. "A flood in '84 ruined many boxes." Yet her tone lacked conviction, and when she left to fetch more volumes, he noticed the narrow drawer in her desk locked with a small brass key she kept on a chain around her neck. That afternoon, he visited the public library, where a collection of newspapers lay bound in cloth. The earliest he could find mention of the troupe was in 1864, a modest notice in a Pittsburgh broadsheet advertising a display of most uncommon natural phenomena rendered with refinement and moral instruction. No names, no faces. The next reference did not appear until 1870 in a report of a winter fair. The gap between the 2 years suggested travel, perhaps abroad, perhaps simply hidden routes. But there was a sameness to the language, a tone that made the passage of time feel irrelevant, as if the company had stepped out for a moment only to return unchanged. The deeper Howe dug, the more resistant the material became. Pages missing from bound newspapers. Ledger leaves torn so cleanly they seemed never to have been written on. Photographs where faces blurred, not from poor exposure, but as though the emulsion itself had recoiled. That evening, as he crossed the bridge toward his lodgings, the fog from the river closed in around him. On the far side, a figure waited beneath a lamppost, slight, still, and watching. Howe slowed his pace, sensing something in the set of its shoulders, the slight tilt of its head. But as he drew nearer, the light flickered once and went out, and the figure was gone. The only trace was the faint echo of footsteps retreating down the cobblestones, keeping time with his own heart. The snow had thickened by morning, coating the courthouse steps in a fine crust that cracked under Howe's boots. He waited until midday, knowing the clerk would take her lunch in the adjoining parlor. The corridor outside her office was silent, but for the faint ticking of a wall clock, its hands sluggish in the cold. He slipped inside, the stale warmth smelling faintly of wool and coal ash. The drawer resisted at first, the brass keyhole dark and narrow, but a slim steel pick, carried in his coat's hidden seam, coaxed the tumblers with a whispering series of clicks. The lock turned. Inside lay a bundle of papers bound with twine, the knot dry and brittle. The top sheet bore a red stamp, special permit, exhibit of human curiosities. The date, 1862. The names listed below were written in the same cramped hand as the Leipzig ledger. Beneath the permits were letters, their envelopes foxed and fraying. The handwriting varied, some ornate, others little more than blocky scrawls. One on thin blue paper caught his eye. To be retained until settlement of account, it read in a trembling script. No salutation, no signature, no account attached. Another bore a list of numbers with months beside them, some crossed out, others circled. The pattern made no immediate sense, until Howe noticed that each circled month corresponded to a local festival or traveling fair. At the bottom of the drawer, wrapped in oilcloth, lay a photograph, larger than most cartes de visite, the image, dim from age. The composition was strange. A bare room, plank walls, a single chair. Seated was a man of indeterminate age, his head tilted slightly, eyes fixed on the camera. His hands were bound in front of him, the rope trailing out of frame. Behind him, at the very edge of the image, a shape intruded. A shoulder, an arm. The light caught on something there, not flesh, but smooth and gleaming as if polished. Howe felt a dry pressure in his throat. He turned the photograph over. On the back, in faint pencil, were the words, Retenido, Marzo de 1865, retained. The word was no longer merely a notation in a ledger. It had weight now, anchored to faces, to rooms, to rope. He replaced the photograph but kept the permits, folding them into his coat. The drawer closed with a muted thud just as the clerk's footsteps sounded in the corridor. Howe stepped into the hall, nodding politely as she passed, her eyes lingering on him a fraction too long. That night, in his room, he spread the papers on the bed. The permits were official enough to withstand casual scrutiny, yet there were no records of fees paid, no municipal inspections logged. They were licenses in name only, slips of paper that opened doors without ever closing them. He imagined the troupe arriving in some unsuspecting town, the documents displayed just long enough to still the questions, and then the descent into cellars, into hidden rooms. The wind rose outside, rattling the loose panes. In the lamplight, the ink on the papers seemed darker, wetter, as if freshly written. Howe leaned closer, the edge of one permit curling upward to reveal a faint stain beneath. Not ink nor water, but something the paper had absorbed long ago, a brownish bloom that trailed toward the twine, like the memory of a drop falling from an unseen hand. By the time spring edged into McKeesport, the river thawed in slow, groaning sheets, and the air carried the heavy scent of mud and rusting metal. Howe had decided to make one last inquiry, a step he had put off for weeks. The journey upriver, to the derelict barn that, according to a local boy, still held something of the old troupe's belongings. The boy's directions were hesitant, as if the place shifted in memory each time it was recalled. The barn stood on a shallow rise, its siding bleached to a ghostly silver, the roof listing toward collapse. The boards gave under Howe's weight, the air inside stale and damp. Dust motes floated in thin light that filtered through warped gaps, their slow drift resembling the lazy fall of ash. At the far wall, under a slanted beam, lay a trunk, its lid warped but intact, the iron hinges furred with orange corrosion. When he pried it open, the first thing he saw was cloth. Costumes, if the word could be stretched to include garments. So small, so strangely proportioned. Sequins dulled to black, stiff leather gloves with the fingers sewn shut. A child's shoe, its sole worn through, the laces fused into a single knot by age and grime. Beneath these, wrapped in yellowed paper, were framed photographs, groups posed stiffly before painted backdrops, the same faces recurring from image to image, their features subtly altered each time. A new scar, a missing tooth, a widening of the eyes. The last photograph had no backdrop. It was the basement room from the earlier picture, but now fully in view. 17 figures sat or stood against the walls, each bound in some way, wrists lashed to knees, chins fixed to chests by lengths of rope. Their faces were turned toward the camera, expressions caught between recognition and resignation. The floor beneath them was bare, except for a single dark channel running from the chair legs to the edge of the frame. Howe did not remember closing the trunk, only the sudden awareness that he was outside again. the barn door swinging gently in the wind. He walked to the river without thinking, the current running high and opaque. The permits in his coat pocket felt heavier than paper, as if they had absorbed something from the trunk, from the room, from the gaze of those bound faces. That night, he laid the documents and photographs on the table in his rented room. The lamplight seemed weaker than usual, failing to illuminate the far corners. The faces in the photographs were barely discernible now, blurred as though by moisture. He reached to turn up the wick, but the glass chimney cracked in his hand with a sharp, dry pop, and the light went out entirely. In the darkness, there was the faintest sound. Not in the street below, not from the walls, but close. Impossibly close, as though a rope were tightening slowly in the still air. He could not tell if it came from above or behind him. He did not turn. He did not move. The sound went on, soft and patient, until it ceased, leaving the room in silence. By morning, the table was bare. The papers, the photographs, even the lamp, gone. Only the faint indentations in the wood remained, the pattern of a folded permit pressed into the grain like the ghost of a signature. And somewhere, perhaps in another locked drawer or forgotten trunk, a photograph now rested. A new one. Its subject seated at a table, eyes fixed forward, hands bound just out of frame.